Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel, Doom Productions, home of the No Budget Film School. And today we are rating my film school textbooks. This is kind of a different video. And the reason I'm doing this is because when you go to film school or college in general, you spend a lot of money on textbooks. And most places you have the option to either buy or rent your textbooks. Buying your textbooks can be really expensive, but you get to keep those books forever or however long you want. Renting your textbooks can be a lot cheaper, but you never know if there's something that you might use years later. I thought this might be a good opportunity to look at my textbooks that I still have and just talk about what I remember about them, what I still use them for, and all that. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this first textbook that I have is Film Art and Introduction, written by David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson. Now, this was the very first film textbook that I ever purchased in my entire life. And I think for that reason alone, which is why I decided to keep it instead of renting it. But this book is a really good introduction to studying films. And I constantly refer back to this textbook. I'll go back to this to look at specific terms, to look at specific concepts, and it's just a really interesting read, especially for beginners if you're just getting into film. I have the 9th edition. I don't know how often they update it. The first time I read this, I remember being pretty engaged and interested in everything that the book talked about. The two authors do a really good job at breaking down film terms and meanings and all that kind of thing. And, you know, it's a book that I still use to this day, as I've said. So, Film Art and Introduction is a keeper. So if you were to get this book assigned to you in college, I would purchase this, not rent it. Okay, up next we have Siegfried Kracauer, the author, his book, Theory of Film. Now, Kracauer was a writer who was writing pretty much in the early days of cinema. He's a pretty big author when it comes to classical film theory. And because film theory was just starting out, a lot of the people who were writing about filmmaking weren't actually film critics, right? They were philosophers, they were scientists, they were in other academic fields who were writing about this new thing called movies. So because a lot of these authors were coming from other academic fields, this book is very, very dense and it's very, very complicated to understand. As you can see, my pages are all marked up with different, notes and citations and things like that, just because it's a really dense read. I don't think filmmakers would have as much use for this book as much as people who want to become film critics. But it's still an interesting read nonetheless. So if you want to go into film criticisms, I would highly recommend buying this book. But if you're a filmmaker, I would probably rent it. It's a book that I hardly revisit just because of how dense and complicated it is. But I'm glad that I have it. So in case I ever want to go back and dive further into some more film criticism, I have this as a good foundation. All right, up next we have Film Theory and Introduction by Robert Stamm. I can't remember what class I got this book in. It might have been in my film reception class, which was studying how audiences reacted to movies. This book really covers the history of film theory and film criticism from the very beginning, starting with guys like Hugo Munsterberg, and takes it all the way up to digital theory and the new media, which is one of the last chapters. The book itself isn't as complicated as the Kracauer textbook. It's really not so much about film theory, but more about the history of film theory. So again, this is a book that I'd recommend if you're interested in film criticism and audiences specifically in sociology, but as a filmmaker, you probably wouldn't have much use for it. To me, I find this really interesting, so I decided to keep it because I thought it was a really interesting read. Up next, we have two books, or rather collected essays, 2 volumes, by Andre Bazin. Andre Bazin is another one of those classical film theory writers. These are called What is Cinema, Volumes 1 and 2. This one's got a foreword from Jean Renoir, and this one has a foreword from Francois Truffaut. Again, same with Kracauer. This stuff is really, really interesting if you're into film criticism and the beginning of film criticism and film theory. But as a filmmaker, you probably wouldn't have much use for it. But it is still interesting, and there's a reason why I kept it. I would say that the Kracauer stuff was a little more complicated to read than this, but this is still pretty dense stuff. I guess to wrap up Andre Bazin, keep it if you're really interested and want to go into film theory and film criticism, but if you're a filmmaker, you probably won't have much practical use for this book. Okay, so this one is probably the most difficult film textbook that I've ever read in my entire life. I still struggle to understand it, and the reason I've kept it is because one day, I swear, I promise that I will understand this book. It's by Stephen Kern, The Culture of Time and Space. This really is not about film at all. The back reads, Stephen Kern writes about the sweeping changes in technology and culture between 1880 and World War I that created new modes of understanding and experiencing time and space. How does that relate to movies? Well, because movies manipulate time and space. So we read this in one of our film criticism classes. There are some really interesting ideas in here, but it is a pain in the butt to try to understand. This book kicked my butt so many times. It's a miracle that I passed this class. And as I said, I'm keeping this book because one day I do want to read it and fully understand it, but there's not a lot of practical use, but there's some good ideas in here nonetheless. And the last film textbook that I have is Shows Sold Separately by Jonathan Gray. This one is all about promos, spoilers, trailers, posters, all that kind of stuff. Everything about a movie or TV show that exists outside the TV show, so a paratext and the text themselves, which is the movies. This book is super interesting. It's not a pain in the butt to read, and it gives you a good idea of how to look at marketing and promoting your movies, which is super duper important. Again, this one kind of goes into the history of paratexts and promotional materials for movies. I think it's really interesting. And if you are assigned to read this book for your class, I think it's really interesting. I think it's worth holding on to, but hey, you might disagree. So those are all my textbooks that I got in film school. Obviously, if you get assigned these textbooks, make your own decision about whether or not you want to rent or purchase them. For me, I ultimately decided to purchase them all. I figured while I was spending all that money in film school, I might as well spend that money to keep these film books so I could keep them with me for as long as I wanted. Each of these books has something really interesting and informative to offer. I obviously kept them because I saw a lot of value in them. But again, if you're the one going to college, you're the one paying that money, you should make that call yourself. But this is just my thoughts on it. That's the video for today, everyone. Hope you found this educational. Let me know in the comments down below if you kept your textbooks from film school or if you decided to just rent them. Thank you for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.